Hey guys, tonight we're following a woman named Georgie, who married one of Victorian England's most celebrated painters, and spent most of her marriage on the wrong side of a closed door. On her wedding day, she owned £30 and a table full of engraving tools. The most powerful art critic in England told her to keep her rooms tidy and never work too hard. Her job was to be an echo of her husband's genius. Her friends once buried William Morris up to the neck in shingle on a beach. And by the end, she'd built a free art gallery for 100,000 people in South London and written the word forever into the contract. We're going to walk with her from a minister's parlour in Birmingham, through paint-smelling studios and small rented rooms, to a quiet house where she finally found something that was hers. Find a comfortable spot. Let everything go still. If these kinds of evenings help you drift off, you're welcome to subscribe so another one's here when you need it. And if you feel like telling me where you're listening from tonight, I'd love to know. Let's begin. Think about what a minister's house smells like. Not the church itself, with its damp stone and old wood and candle wax, but the house beside it. The one where the family actually lives. It smells like coal dust and boiled linen, and the faintly sweet, floury warmth of bread that's just been taken out of the oven. There's a carpet on the parlour floor, but it's thin, and you can feel the cold boards underneath if you stand in one place too long. The curtains are clean but not new. Everything in this house is clean but not new. This is a Methodist minister's household in the 1840s and 50s, and the family that lives here is called MacDonald. The father, George, is a preacher, a good one apparently, the kind who genuinely loves standing before a congregation and letting the words pour out of him. He's away from home most of the week, travelling from one preaching engagement to the next, and his wife Hannah is left behind with the children. There are 11 of them eventually, though not all survive infancy. Hannah runs the house almost alone, and Georgie, looking back on it years later, described her mother as being nearly as lonely as a widow, in the daily struggle of keeping everyone fed and clothed and reasonably well behaved. You know, there's something about that phrase, almost as lonely as a widow, that I keep coming back to. Because Hannah's husband isn't gone. He's alive and well and doing exactly what he loves, out in the world, speaking to crowds. But back in the house, with the washing and the mending and the children who need things, Hannah is doing the invisible work that makes his life possible. And Georgie noticed it. She noticed it as a child, and she wrote about it decades later, and you can't help wondering how much of what she saw in her own marriage was already taking shape in her mother's kitchen, long before she had a name for it. The MacDonalds move constantly, and that's part of the Methodist circuit. Every 3 years, a new station, a new town, a new parsonage to make habitable. By the time Georgie is in her teens, the family has lived in half a dozen places across the Midlands and then in London, where her father holds successive ministries in Sloane Street and Marylebone. There's something about that constant uprooting that shapes the sisters in a particular way. They learn to rely on each other rather than on any one place. They learn to carry their household with them, to set up a home quickly and let it go without too much grieving. The family becomes its own country, portable and self-sustaining, and the bonds between the sisters, fierce, practical, shot through with private jokes and shared labour, are the strongest thing any of them will ever have. The girls grow up resourceful, they sew their own clothes, they learn to mend and to manage a household on almost nothing because the ministry doesn't pay well and there's never quite enough. They practice the piano, they learn to draw. These are the usual accomplishments expected of respectable young women, the things that will make them presentable when the time comes to find a husband. Because everyone in this family understands, without needing to say it aloud, that the girl's only future is marriage. 2 shillings and 6pence a week is set aside for Harry, the eldest boy, because Harry is going to King Edward's School in Birmingham and then to Oxford. The girls get a governess now and then, or they're sent to what Georgie called the usual young ladies' school, but she's honest about what that amounted to. Girls in those days, she wrote, had small chances of education, and not much in the way of fresh ideas reached them through those lessons. And they know what's expected of them. Even as very small children, they know. There's a conversation Georgie recorded from when she was barely 4 years old. Her sister Carrie, aged 5, asked the table at large what marriage was. Georgie answered immediately. "It's staying at home," she said. Carrie disagreed. "No, it's going out to breakfast and getting a husband." Their older sister Alice, who was 7 and therefore the authority, pointed out that their father was married and he didn't have a husband, which put a dent in the theory. And Georgie, 4 years old, sitting in a minister's parlour with a straight back and a decided expression, announced that whatever marriage was, she definitely intended to do it. Their sister Aggie would later add, with the worldly wisdom of a girl who's been paying attention, truly it is advisable for us to marry, if the right thing turns up. I don't know why that stays with me so much. Maybe it's because she was right, in a way she couldn't possibly have understood yet. Marriage was staying at home. That's exactly what it turned out to be. Not all of them accept the life they've been given with equal quietness. Alice has a sharp tongue and a rebellious streak that surfaces at unexpected moments. During one of their many moves, she finds a faded envelope tucked away in a drawer, a precious family relic containing a lock of Charles Wesley's hair, the great hymn writer, the founding father of their whole tradition. Alice takes one look at it and throws it straight into the fire. See, she says, a hair of the dog that bit us. You can almost hear the silence that follows, and you can almost hear Georgie, watching from the corner, filing it away. There's a story from this period that tells you a great deal about Georgie herself. A heated argument breaks out among the young people about whether, in desperate circumstances, a person could bring themselves to eat a mouse. One of the boys, Wilfred Healy, declares that he certainly could. So Alice, the same Alice who burned the Wesley relic, actually cooks a little mouse pie and presents it to him. Wilfred can't do it. He looks at the pie and loses his nerve entirely, but Georgie, who is small and quiet and hasn't said much during the argument, picks up a fork and eats a mouthful. She is the kind of person who, once she's decided something, simply does it. That quality, that steady, stubborn, undramatic determination, is the thread that runs through everything that follows. Georgie's own talents run to music and to drawing. She sings, plays the piano, and has a genuine gift for arranging words and music together, fitting poems to melodies in a way that people admire. Her drawing is considered good enough to earn her a place at the School of Design in South Kensington, which is no small thing for a minister's daughter, with no money and no particular connections. She takes it seriously. She and a fellow student once pooled their pennies to buy a print they could copy at home, outside of class hours, because the hunger to learn was that strong. Years later, she dismissed it all. I had a certain deftness of hand, she wrote, but I did not learn anything vital. But that's the older Georgie talking, the one who'd learned to make herself smaller. The younger Georgie walked to South Kensington and back with a portfolio under her arm, and she was proud of it. There's something worth sitting with here. The way Victorian women of this class were trained to downplay their own abilities. Not with false modesty exactly, but with a genuine internalised belief that their talents were, as one family account put it, more interpretive than creative. The girls could copy, they could arrange, they could accompany, but the real work, the original, important work, that was for the men. And the remarkable thing is how early this message landed, and how deeply it stuck even in someone as clear-eyed as Georgie. What the sisters learn, beyond sewing and hymns and the management of small incomes, they learn from their brothers' friends, from the young men who come to the house in the evenings and talk about things that nobody else talks about. The MacDonald girls are taught without anyone saying it to admire their brothers' companions. The young men of the Birmingham set, as they're called at Oxford, come to dinner and fill the rooms with conversation about art and poetry and architecture, and the girls listen with an attention that Georgie described without any embarrassment at all. They were interesting and amusing beyond words, she wrote. And the way she said it, you can feel the excitement of a girl who's been living on hymn tunes and careful economy, suddenly discovering that there are people in the world who care passionately about colour and beauty and the meaning of things. One of those young men is called Edward Jones. Ned, everyone calls him. He's the only son of a struggling Birmingham tradesman, a boy who's been pushed and encouraged and lovingly propelled towards something better than his father's shop. He wins a place at Oxford, where he falls in with William Morris. Topsy, as everyone calls him, a stocky, restless, wealthy young man with a ferocious temper and a passion for medieval things. Together they decide to become artists. Ned leaves Oxford untidily at the end of 1855 and arrives in London with very little money and a burning conviction that painting is the most important thing in the world. He starts spending evenings at the MacDonald's house. He's lonely. His closest friend is still up at Oxford, and the only regular company he has in London is Gabriel Rossetti, who takes him on long walks through the city after dark, through gaslit streets where the shadows move and the women standing in doorways aren't the kind a minister's daughter would know about. Ned is young and idealistic, and a little frightened by that side of London and the MacDonald household. Warm, moral, full of sisters who sing around the piano. Feels like the solid ground he needs. Georgie is 15, Ned is 22, and in the summer of 1856, after walking her to the Royal Academy exhibition, and sometimes meeting her on her way home from drawing class, he does the proper thing. He asks her parents for permission to marry her. It's all done correctly. The formal request, the father's consideration, the solemn conversation between mother and daughter afterwards, when Georgie is summoned to be told the news and given her parents' blessing. Her father doesn't ask about money, because the MacDonalds aren't in a position to demand financial guarantees, and because he honestly believes that affection is more valuable than income. Ned has almost nothing, but he has talent, and he has the kind of earnest sincerity that a Methodist minister recognises. The engagement will be long, everyone knows this. Neither of them seems to mind. Ned can come to the house in the evenings now, properly, as Georgie's intended, and she can live for those hours when they're alone together. His first gifts to her are books, his own favourites, works about medieval romance and the poetry of Christian art. Morris gives her sister Aggie a copy of the Arabian Nights, as a sort of present for the whole family, and it gets read and reread aloud in the parlour until the binding goes soft. There's something tender about that, about a courtship conducted through shared books, in a house where Shakespeare is still forbidden on grounds of immorality. She first met Morris at the Royal Academy in 1855, and he called on the family a year later in correct fashion, bringing Turner's Rivers of France as an engagement gift. He was Ned's nearest friend, the person Ned talked about most, the one whose name came up at every dinner. But Georgie didn't take to him, not at first. "We were not much the nearer for this meeting," she wrote later, "of the man who, after her husband, would eventually mean the most to her in the world. But she couldn't know that yet. All she saw was a large, loud, restless young man who seemed to belong to a different species from her quiet Ned. Morris had money, real money, a private income, and a way of filling a room with his energy that left Georgie feeling a little flattened. She would learn to love him, deeply and steadily, but that was decades away. For now he was just Topsy, Ned's friend, the one who gave them the Arabian Nights. The engagement settles into a rhythm. Ned comes to the MacDonald house in the evenings, and they sit together in the parlour while the younger sisters come and go and Hannah moves quietly in the kitchen. Sometimes Ned talks about what he's been working on, what Rossetti said, what Morris is building, which painting is giving him trouble. Georgie listens and stores it all away, carefully, the way her mother stores the household linen, folded, pressed, put aside for when it's needed. She doesn't know yet that some of it will never be unfolded again. In the spring of 1857, Ned takes Georgie to Birmingham to meet his father and his old nurse, Miss Sampson. Miss Sampson has looked after Ned since his mother died shortly after he was born, and her feelings about him are fierce and absolute. An angel from heaven wouldn't have been good enough for her boy, as far as she was concerned. At dinner, Georgie, true to her Methodist upbringing, doesn't touch the wine. And Ned, with the kind of small, sweet gesture that makes you understand why she loved him, picks up the water jug and pours her glass from a great height so the water catches the candlelight and sparkles like something it isn't. Miss Sampson mutters darkly about flirtatious absurdity, but Georgie keeps the memory for the rest of her life. She's introduced to Rossetti at his rooms in Chatham Place, and she's awestruck. She's taken to see Millet's studio. Gradually the contours of this strange bohemian world come into focus. She has no precise idea, she admits, of what the profession of art actually means, but she feels instinctively that it's good to be among people who paint pictures and write poetry. Years later, looking back, she tried to find words for what it felt like. "I felt in the presence of a new religion," she wrote. "Their love of beauty didn't seem unbalanced, but as if it included the whole world. That's a 15-year-old girl from a house where the greatest sin was a spiteful remark." And suddenly she's standing in rooms full of half-finished canvases, breathing in turpentine, watching men argue about colour and myth and truth, and something inside her recognises it as sacred. She starts painting lessons with Ford Madox Brown, and she describes this with characteristic modesty, his incredible kindness in allowing me to come and try to paint from a model in his studio. She goes, and she works, and she's prouder of this than of almost anything else in her girlhood. For a little while she's not just a minister's daughter waiting to be married. She's a student with a brush in her hand, learning something real. And then there's the evening at Red Lion Square, the studio that Ned shares with Morris. A piano has been hired specially for the occasion, and Georgie and her sister come to make music for the guests. Ned writes to Brown beforehand, promising food and cheerful disorder and a stunner or two to make melody. The stunners are Georgie and her sister, and the melody is a set of old troubadour songs that Georgie has arranged and practiced. She plays and sings for a room full of young painters, and they love it. And for one evening the minister's daughter is at the very centre of this strange, brilliant, paint-stained world. She's also taken to Little Holland House, where a grander generation of artistic women hold court, the Pattle sisters, married into various distinguished families, presiding over dimly lit rooms with dark passages that open into tall, airy studios. The table is spread with what Georgie calls boundless welcome, and everything shimmers with a casual, confident elegance that's completely foreign to anything she's known. These women move through their lives with an ease that the MacDonald sisters can only watch and marvel at. And Georgie is aware, sharply, quietly aware, that Ned has been spending time here, in this world, while she waits at home. She doesn't say she felt inadequate. What she says, years later, with the precise understatement that runs through all her writing, is simply this: I could not then realise what this visit must have meant to him. And you can hear, in that sentence, the older woman looking back at the younger one, knowing what she didn't know then. But for now, none of that has weight. For now, there's just a girl in a minister's house, with a thin carpet under her feet and a book in her lap, and the slow tick of a clock that's in no hurry at all. The fire shifts and settles. The coals rearrange themselves with a soft collapsing sound. And somewhere in London, in a cold studio that smells of turpentine and linseed oil, a young man with paint on his fingers is thinking of her, and she knows it. And for tonight, that's more than enough. On the eve of her wedding in June of 1860, Georgie counted up what she and Ned had between them. The answer was £30 in cash, earned from Ned's paintings, and a small deal table with a drawer in it that held her wood engraving tools. That was it. That was everything they owned in the world, the £30 and the table. And here's the thing I keep turning over. She didn't list the table as furniture. She listed it as something that mattered to her. It was, as far as she was concerned, her only significant possession. And what made it significant wasn't the wood, or the legs, or the drawer. It was the tools inside it. The chisels and the gouges and the little blocks of boxwood. That table was Georgie's claim to being something other than a wife. It was the physical proof that she too had work of her own. That she was an artist, however modestly, with tools and intentions and a space cleared on a surface just for her. She brought it into the marriage the way another bride might bring a hope chest full of linen. And Ned brought his brushes and his pens, and for a little while those two sets of tools sat in the same room together, side by side as if they were equals. The wedding almost didn't happen when it did. Left to himself, Ned might have let the engagement stretch on for years more. He wasn't in any hurry, and the money wasn't there, and he had that peculiar ability some people have to let time pass without making decisions. It was Ford Madox Brown who finally pushed the thing along. Georgie had been staying with the Browns in their cramped rooms in Fortis Terrace, sleeping somewhere among the canvases and the children, playing piano in the evenings, amusing little Nolly, and generally making herself useful in that cheerful, competent way that was second nature to her. Brown liked her. Emma liked her. And after a few weeks of watching Ned drift in and out of the house without any sign of fixing a date, Brown took the young man aside and told him plainly that he had better get married without delay. No arguments about poverty would be entertained. Brown himself had survived babies in near destitution, and he wasn't sympathetic to excuses. And just like that, according to Georgie, the matter was settled. The wedding would be in Manchester in June, on the 4th anniversary of their engagement, in the same church where her parents had married. Ned was terrified. He said it out loud, which was unusual for a man in that era, though perhaps not for Ned, who never quite learned how to hide his feelings. "I shouldn't be surprised," he told someone, "if I bolt off the day before and am never heard of again." He didn't bolt, but his body did the next best thing. On the morning of the wedding, he woke up with his throat swollen shut. Stress, the kind that seizes the body when the mind can't find words for what it's afraid of. He got through the ceremony somehow. Georgie was nearly 20, Ned was 27, and they set off for Chester, where they'd planned to spend the night before crossing to France. Imagine this. Your first morning as a married woman. You wake up in a hotel room in a strange city, and your husband is lying in bed unable to speak, barely able to swallow, shivering under the blankets as if something has broken inside him that wasn't physical. The honeymoon to Paris, where they were supposed to meet Gabriel Rossetti and his own new wife, isn't going to happen. Instead, Georgie is going to spend her first days of marriage in this room, nursing a man who cannot tell her what's wrong because he doesn't know himself. At some point during that first morning, her necklace catches on the bedpost and breaks. The beads scatter across the floor. And Georgie gets down on her hands and knees to pick them up one by one in a strange hotel room, and she cries. I think about those beads sometimes. Such a small, specific detail. You'd think it wouldn't matter. A broken necklace, a few beads on a wooden floor. But it was the moment when the real shape of her marriage first showed itself. Not the romance, not the troubadour songs, not the books given and received with such tenderness. But this, the kneeling, the gathering up, the quiet weeping in a room where someone else's needs have already, on the very first day, eclipsed your own. And the strange thing is, she didn't blame him. She couldn't. It was simply what marriage was. It was staying at home. She'd known that since she was 4 years old. They didn't get to France. Georgie wrote to cancel the Paris arrangement. Gabriel wrote back from abroad, making light of the disappointment, saying Lizzie was too unwell to do much anyway. Instead, he reported, they'd been reading Pepys together. The most comic book in the world, he called it, and amusing themselves collecting mangled English from French hotel menus. It's a funny letter, warm and chaotic and full of Gabriel's particular energy, and you can sense Georgie reading it in a Chester hotel room, smiling despite herself, while Ned coughed and dozed beside her. It was Brown who had arranged the whole thing, really. Not just the push to get married, but the example of how it could be done. Brown and Emma had been living on almost nothing for years, painting, keeping house, raising children in rooms that were barely large enough for the canvases, let alone the family. Emma had once set up a soup kitchen in her own front room during a time of unemployment, feeding strangers when she could barely feed herself. She was poor then, her granddaughter wrote later, and had to go without all sorts of things to get the money. And yet it worked. Not comfortably, not easily, but it worked. Because Emma and Brown believed in each other, and because the artistic community around them, messy, quarrelsome, generous, held them up when they couldn't hold themselves. When Georgie looked at the Browns, she saw a version of the marriage she wanted. Not glamorous, not easy, but shared. The contrast with Morris was stark. Topsy had money. Real money. A private income of £600 to £900 a year from his father's shares, which in the 1860s was enough to live very well indeed. He and Jane were building a house, a whole house, designed from scratch by their friend Philip Webb, set in the Kent countryside with orchards and gardens, and rooms large enough to paint murals on the walls. The Morrises would never have to count their £30. Jane, who'd grown up in a family whose annual income probably never reached £50, had stepped into a world of carpets and servants and silverware that must have felt like a dream, or a very elaborate performance she hadn't quite learned the lines for. Georgie knew the difference. She'd always known it. But she didn't envy Jane, or if she did, she never said so. What she envied, perhaps, was the space, the physical, literal space in which to live and work and breathe without bumping into someone else's things every time you turned around. When Ned recovered enough to travel, they went back to London and settled into their first home. Small rented rooms, modest and cramped, the kind of place where you can hear the neighbours through the wall and the stairs creak underfoot. There's no record of exactly what those rooms looked like, but you can piece it together from what was typical for a young artistic couple of their means. A sitting room that doubles as a parlour, with a coal fire that needs constant feeding. A bedroom that's cold in the mornings until someone gets up and lays the grate. A kitchen of some kind, though Georgie would have had little help. Perhaps a girl who came in by the day, perhaps no one at all for those first lean months. The furniture is sparse, the curtains are probably ones Georgie sewed herself. And somewhere in that small space, Ned has his easel, his brushes, his paints, his drawings pinned to the wall or propped against the skirting board, and the perpetual smell of turpentine that works itself into everything and never quite leaves. But here's what makes those early rooms different from everything that comes after. The door is open. I mean that almost literally. In these first months of marriage, Georgie sits in the studio while Ned works. She reads aloud to him, hour after hour, book after book, while he paints. She's there. She's part of it. The smell of linseed oil is in her hair, on her clothes, in the fabric of her days. She can see the painting taking shape. She can watch the colours change as the light moves across the room. And Ned wants her there. He likes the sound of her voice. He likes knowing that she's close. The studio in these early months belongs to both of them. I find that hard to let go of. The image of Georgie reading aloud in a small paint-smelling room while Ned works at his easel. It's such an intimate thing, reading to someone. You have to match your pace to theirs. You have to sense when they're listening closely and when they've drifted into the work and are only half hearing the words, using your voice as a kind of current beneath the painting. And there's something about it that isn't servile, not in those early months. It's collaborative. She's providing something he needs, not just the sound, but the steady, warm presence of another mind in the room, feeding him stories and poems and history, while he translates whatever he's hearing into line and colour. They're working together, in their own way. The tools are still side by side, and there's a particular quality to reading aloud that I think matters here, and that we've mostly lost. In the 1860s, before recorded sound, before radio, before any kind of mechanical entertainment, the human voice was the only way to fill a room with story. When Georgie read to Ned, she wasn't doing something quaint or decorative. She was performing one of the most fundamental domestic arts, the art of making time bearable, of turning silence into something inhabited. And she was good at it. She had a musician's instinct for pacing, for emphasis, for when to let a sentence land and when to carry it forward. She'd been doing it since girlhood, reading the Arabian Nights aloud in the McDonald parlour until the binding went soft. Now she was doing it in her husband's studio, and the continuity must have felt right. The same voice, the same patience, just a different room and a different listener. The young couple is not alone in this world. They're surrounded by friends, other painters, other wives, other men and women who are trying to figure out how to live and make art at the same time. Georgie describes the early months of marriage as one continuous stream of hospitality, and you can feel the warmth of it. The evenings when people drop by without warning, the dinners that stretch late, the conversations that range from pigments to poetry to the nature of beauty itself. Morris comes, filling the room with his restless energy and his booming voice. Brown comes, quieter, more considered, bringing Emma with him sometimes. Gabriel comes with his dark, nervous magnetism, always at the centre of things, even when he isn't trying to be. And Georgie plays the piano for them, and arranges supper from whatever's in the kitchen, and listens, and for a while the whole circle feels like a family, chaotic, affectionate, held together by a shared belief that what they're doing matters. Not long after the wedding, Georgie and Ned meet Gabriel's new wife Lizzie for the first time. They arrange to meet at the Zoological Gardens, the official meeting point, as Gabriel puts it with characteristic theatricality, being the Wombat's lair. The Browns are there too, Emma, Brown, little Lucy, and for an afternoon this odd sprawling group of artists and wives wanders among the enclosures, looking at animals that most of them find more interesting than they'd expected. Georgie goes home with the Rossettis afterwards to their rooms in Hampstead, and she's struck immediately by Lizzie's presence. Lizzie has just returned from Paris, and she moves through the small upstairs bedroom with the lattice window carrying herself in a way that Georgie, fresh from a minister's household and a deal table, can only watch with quiet wonder. What stays with her most is Lizzie's hair, deep red, worn loosely, falling in soft, heavy wings when she takes off her bonnet. And there, in that small bedroom, Lizzie shows Georgie a drawing she's just finished. Two women, not so different in age, standing in a room together, one showing the other her work. Georgie later wrote that she sensed, even then, something of the beauty and the sadness that moved between Lizzie and Gabriel, though she couldn't have put it into words and couldn't have known how it would end. But I don't want to follow Lizzie's story tonight. I want to stay with Georgie, in the small rooms in the early light. She'd told her mother that the world she'd entered was not so sheltered as the one she'd grown up in. That was her way of saying, without alarming anyone, that she'd left behind the strict certainties of the minister's household and stepped into something that had no clear rules. The artistic world didn't operate by Methodist principles. People loved and lived in arrangements that would have made her father uneasy. And the line between admiration and something else, something more complicated, wasn't always clear. Georgie noticed all of this with that same quiet, careful attention she'd brought to everything since childhood, and she didn't retreat. She simply took it in and held her ground. What struck her most, I think, was not the bohemianism, the unconventional living arrangements, the women who modelled for a living, the casual attitudes toward things that would have scandalised a Methodist congregation. What struck her was the seriousness. These people genuinely believed that making beautiful things was a kind of moral duty, as binding as any commandment. They argued about the right shade of blue the way her father argued about the right reading of a psalm. They worked themselves into exhaustion over a painting the way Hannah worked herself into exhaustion over a household. And Georgie recognised that seriousness, because it was her own. She came from people who took things seriously. Faith, duty, family, the proper folding of linen. She'd simply found a different set of things to be serious about. The transfer was almost seamless. Where her mother had a hymn book, Georgie had a sketchbook. Where her father had a pulpit, Ned had an easel. The intensity was the same. Only the objects of devotion had changed. She'd given up her religion too, given it up while she was still young, without drama, without any great scene. Her family's way was to leave disagreements unspoken. Hannah kept her feelings about Georgie's apostasy to herself, only once suggesting gently that she might at least send the children to church, even if she couldn't bring herself to go. Georgie didn't, but she wasn't without faith. She'd simply replaced one kind with another. She believed in art. She believed in work, in moral seriousness, in the obligation to be useful and honest and kind. And she believed, in those early months, that marriage could be a true partnership, that she and Ned could share the studio and the labour and the meaning of it all. She expected companionship, not submission. And for a little while, in those small rooms, with the fire going and the turpentine in the air, and her voice filling the space while he painted, that's exactly what she had. The rooms are quiet now. The visitors have gone home. The fire has been banked for the night, and the coals tick softly as they cool. Ned's palette is set aside, the brushes standing in their jar of spirits. Georgie's book lies closed on the arm of the chair, the page marked with a ribbon, and somewhere in the drawer of that small deal table, the engraving tools wait, clean and sharp, ready for hands that will come back to them tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. They don't know yet that the day keeps getting pushed further and further away. For now, the tools are there, the door is open, and the two of them are still in the same room. Georgie took up wood engraving during the engagement, when she was still living with her family in London, and Ned was at his studio in Russell Place. It was a quiet, exacting craft. You sat at a table with a block of boxwood no bigger than your hand, and you cut into it with fine-tipped tools, following lines that had been drawn on the surface in ink, working in reverse so that the finished block could be pressed into paper and produce an image that read the right way round. It required patience, a steady hand, good eyes, and the kind of focused concentration that shuts the rest of the world out for hours at a time. Georgie was good at it. She had what she called a certain deftness of hand, although she always said it as if it barely counted, as if deftness were a minor domestic skill, like hemming a straight seam, rather than the thing it actually was, which was talent. Her younger sister Louie took it up too, and Ned encouraged them both. He made a promise that one day the three of them would illustrate a book together. LM and EJ, he said, as if putting their initials side by side made the partnership official. It was a kind thing to say. Whether he meant it fully, or whether it was one of those generous gestures that young idealists make before the world sorts out whose work actually gets done, and whose gets set aside, is impossible to know. But Georgie held on to the promise. She kept it the way she kept everything, carefully, without fuss, tucked away in a drawer alongside the tools themselves. The engraving wasn't entirely her own, and this matters. She wasn't designing original compositions on the wood block. She was cutting her husband's drawings, translating his lines into the medium, performing the slow, painstaking labour of turning a sketch into something that could be printed. It was skilled work, real work, but it was also, by its nature, secondary. She was serving his art, not making her own, and there's a whole era's worth of assumptions packed into that arrangement. The idea that a wife's artistic ability is most properly used in the service of her husband's vision, that her hands are at their best when they're tracing the contours of his imagination rather than following the contours of her own. What makes this even more poignant is that Georgie had tried to do original work. Before the engraving, there had been the painting lessons with Brown, real studio practice, working from a model, learning the fundamentals of colour and form, and before that the drawing classes at South Kensington, where she'd walked with her portfolio under her arm and pulled pennies with a fellow student to buy prints to copy at home. She had taken those things seriously. Brown himself had looked at her work and said, with his usual wary understatement, that this little girl seemed to threaten to turn out another genius. It was the closest thing to high praise that Brown gave anyone, and Georgie treasured it. But the art lessons ended when she married. The drawing, she later admitted, was soon abandoned entirely, and the engraving, the one skill she kept, was redirected from her own designs to her husband's. There was a brief, tantalising moment when something different seemed possible. In the early months after both couples married, Lizzie Rossetti, also newlywed, also an artist, talked with Georgie about working together. They planned to illustrate a book of fairy tales. It would be their project, their collaboration, something that existed apart from the men and their canvases. Gabriel was enthusiastic about Lizzie's abilities, telling a friend that she had real genius in conception and colour, and that her latest designs would surprise and delight anyone who saw them. He believed she would paint pictures such as no woman had painted yet, though he added, catching himself, that there was no use hoping for too much. The fairy tale book never happened. Lizzie's health was failing, her concentration fraying, and the project drifted away the way such plans do when the conditions for real work — time, health, confidence, a room of one's own — are never quite right. But for a moment, two women had looked at each other and imagined making something together. And that tells you Georgie didn't accept the echo role without resistance. She wanted to be a voice, not a reflection. She just couldn't find the room for it. There's a pattern here that repeats across so many women's lives in this period, and isn't always visible unless you're looking for it. A girl shows talent. She's encouraged, genuinely, warmly, by people who mean well. She takes lessons. She improves. She begins to imagine a future in which her work matters. And then she marries, and the encouragement doesn't stop exactly, but it changes shape. It becomes conditional. It acquires qualifications. Never work hard at it. Keep your rooms tidy first. Do as much as you've time and liking for. The talent doesn't disappear. The tools don't rust. But the space around them shrinks, slowly and steadily, until one day the woman looks up from whatever she's been doing instead, the mending, the nursing, the household, and realises that the pretty scheme has dropped through, quietly, while she wasn't watching. Nobody put this more clearly, or more devastatingly, than John Ruskin. Ruskin was the most powerful art critic in England, a man whose opinions could make or break a painter's career, and he was also a friend of the circle. Ned admired him, Gabriel relied on him, and even Morris, who didn't rely on anyone, treated Ruskin's views with a grudging respect. Georgie wrote to him at some point to tell him she was continuing her engraving, and Ruskin wrote back. The letter is something you have to sit with for a moment, because it tells you so much about the world Georgie was living in, not just the artistic world, but the wider one, the one that shaped what women were allowed to want. Ruskin began by saying he was delighted to hear about the woodcutting. It wouldn't, he believed, interfere with any motherly care or duty, and it was far more noble and useful work than any other of which feminine fingers were capable without too much disturbance of feminine thought and nature. You can feel the whole weight of Victorian thinking pressing down on that sentence. The careful distinction between feminine fingers and the unnamed other kind. The reassurance that this particular craft wouldn't disturb the essential femininity that was, in Ruskin's view, the most important thing a woman possessed. But it got worse. Ruskin went on to say that he couldn't imagine anything prettier or more wifely than cutting one's husband's drawings on the woodblock. There was, he said, just the proper quality of echo in it. Echo. Not voice. Echo. The wife's role was to reflect her husband's work, faithfully and with affection, adding no original note of her own. And then came the final instruction, the one that Georgie remembered for the rest of her life. Never work hard at it, Ruskin told her. Keep your rooms tidy and baby happy, and then after that as much woodwork as you've time and liking for. Keep your rooms tidy and baby happy, as if the engraving were a hobby to be fitted into the gaps between real duties, as if the tools in the drawer were toys, as if the deftness of hand and the patient, skilled, concentrated labour of cutting a block were something you might do in a spare half hour between sweeping the floor and feeding the child, the way you might pick up a piece of knitting or flip through a magazine. And there were evenings when the music itself became a kind of argument, not a loud one, not a confrontation, but a quiet assertion of presence. When Georgie sat down at the piano and played a Beethoven arrangement she'd made herself, choosing the particular sonata movement that would carry a particular set of words, she was doing something that nobody had asked her to do, and nobody had given her permission for. She was making aesthetic decisions. She was saying, "This poem needs this music, and here is why, and listen." The people in the room, Ned, Morris, Gabriel, whoever happened to be there, listened, and they were moved, and they praised her, and then they went back to talking about painting. But for the duration of the music, Georgie was the one making the art. Her hands on the keys, her voice in the air, her choices shaping what everyone in the room felt. It wasn't wood engraving, it wasn't drawing, but it was hers. She set one of Keats's poems to a passage from Beethoven, and the people who heard it said it was beautiful, that she had a rare instinct for the way words and melody could lean into each other, each one carrying weight the other couldn't carry alone. She set one of Gabriel's poems too, which must have been a delicate thing to do. To take the words of a man she knew, a man who sat in her parlour and ate her food and talked too much and filled every room with his restless energy, and to hold those words inside a piece of music and give them back, transformed, made tender by the melody she'd wrapped around them. That isn't echo, that's interpretation, that's art. Georgie's own comment on Ruskin's letter, written years later, was just 7 words. Alas, time and liking never came together. And then she added, with a dry, defeated wit that's easy to miss if you're not listening closely, that the pretty scheme had dropped through finding a place, let us hope, among the pieces of porphyry or serpentine with which Edward claimed that good intentions pave the floor of heaven. It's a joke, a careful, self-deprecating joke about the death of her artistic ambitions, and underneath the joke there's something that hurts to touch. I keep thinking about the word echo, because Ruskin didn't just describe what Georgie was doing, he prescribed it. He told her that the proper relationship between a wife's art and her husband's was that of an echo to a voice. The original sound belongs to him, the repetition, fainter and secondary, belongs to her, and the terrible thing is that Ruskin wasn't being cruel. He wasn't trying to diminish Georgie. In his own mind, he was paying her a compliment. He was telling her that she'd found the perfect expression of wifely devotion, faithful, skilled, self-effacing. He genuinely believed that a woman's highest artistic achievement was to serve as an echo of her husband's genius. This was the dominant view. Ruskin articulated it most powerfully in his famous lecture on the education of women, where he laid out his vision of what a woman should be, enduringly, incorruptibly good, wise not for self-development but for self-renunciation, wise not that she may set herself above her husband but that she may never fail from his side. The adjectives were beautiful. The message was clear. Women should serve. But Georgie had her music, and that's something Ruskin couldn't touch. She played the piano, she sang, and she had a genuine gift for arrangement, for taking words and melodies and fitting them together in ways that moved the people who heard them. During this period she set poems by Keats and by Gabriel Rossetti to extracts from Beethoven, and she was much praised for both the arrangement and the performance. This was real creative work, not echo, but composition. She was choosing the poems, she was choosing the music. She was hearing in her own mind how a set of words would sound against a particular sequence of notes, and she was making that happen with her own hands on the keys and her own voice in the room. There's something about music that made it more acceptable for women, I think. It was classed as an accomplishment rather than an art, something that made a woman pleasant to be around, like good manners or a well-set table. Nobody would have called Georgie's piano playing a career, or treated it with the seriousness that Ned's painting received. But precisely because it was undervalued, it was also unpoliced. Nobody told Georgie to keep her rooms tidy, and then play as much piano as she had time and liking for. And so, in the space that was left unguarded, she did real work. Quiet, beautiful, undramatic work that the people around her genuinely loved. At Red House, during those warm visits to the Morrises in the summer and autumn of 1860, the days had a rhythm that showed what Georgie's life might have looked like if things had gone differently. In the mornings, she and Jane sat together, Jane at the embroidery frame, Georgie at her wood engraving, while the men painted murals on the walls upstairs. It was companionable, unhurried work. 2 women side by side in a room with good light, each absorbed in her own craft. In the afternoons, they sometimes took the Red House wagonette and went exploring, driving through the lanes of what was then still deep Kent countryside, navigating with a map spread across their knees, finding villages with names like St Mary Cray and St Paul's Cray. And in the evenings everyone came together, men and women, art and play, for boisterous games and jokes and the kind of collective laughter that only happens when people are young and certain they're inventing the future. They played hide and seek. Georgie remembered one evening in particular. Jane as the seeker, moving slowly through the house, beautiful and intent, creeping closer and closer to the room where she was sure Ned must be hiding. And then the startled cry when she found him, and his great peal of laughter as he burst from his hiding place. Adults, playing like children, in a house they'd designed themselves, with the smell of fresh plaster still in the air and the paint still tacky on the walls. It's such a small, warm image, and it sits inside this story like a lamp in a window, a glimpse of what life could feel like when nobody was keeping score, when nobody's art was more important than anyone else's, when the women weren't echoes and the men weren't gods, and the whole thing was just a game of hide and seek in a beautiful house on a summer evening. But those mornings with the engraving tools and the embroidery frame, those were ending even as they happened. One morning, sitting beside Jane, Georgie noticed something in her friend's sewing basket. Not the usual decorative work, not the embroidered hangings and cushion covers that the women made for the house. Something different. A small, shapeless garment, fine and soft. A little shirt for him or her. Jane was pregnant, and Georgie, though she might not have known it yet, would follow soon. The new phase was beginning, the one that would change everything. But that's the next chapter. For now, I want to stay here a moment longer, in the space where the tools still matter, where Georgie's hands can still move between the piano keys and the engraving block, between the music she's composing and the lines she's cutting, between the work that's hers and the work that serves as someone else's echo. She hasn't given any of it up yet. Ruskin's letter has arrived, and she's read it, and she's filed it away the way she files everything, carefully, without comment, in a place where she can find it again when she needs to understand what happened to her life. But the tools are still sharp, the piano's still open, and the pretty scheme hasn't dropped through yet. It's still hovering, somewhere between intention and surrender, in that quiet, painful space where most women's ambitions lived in the middle of the 19th century. Acknowledged, encouraged in theory, and gently, firmly set aside. The fire has burned low. The block of boxwood sits on the table, half finished. The lines cut clean and precise where Georgie's hand has been. The piano lid is down but not locked. And somewhere in the next room, Ned is working, his brush moving steadily across the canvas, making the sounds that Georgie knows by heart. The soft scrape of bristle on stretched cloth, the clink of the brush handle against the jar, the occasional low hum he makes when something is going well. She can hear him. She's always been able to hear him. The door between them is still open, but it's narrower now than it was, and soon, not tonight, but soon, it will begin to close. You take the train from London Bridge, heading south and east into Kent. In the 1860s, this is still countryside. Not the carefully preserved countryside of later decades, but actual working land, with orchards and coppices and lanes that go soft with mud in winter. The station is Bexley, and from there it's a short walk to Upton, where the road turns past hedgerows thick with hawthorn, and the air smells of apple blossom in the spring, and damp earth in the autumn. And then you see it. A house built in red brick, set in the middle of an old orchard, with cherry trees pressing close to the walls and the whole place looking like it's grown up out of the ground rather than been placed on top of it. This is Red House. William Morris built it. Or rather, he had it built. Designed to his specifications by his friend Philip Webb, the architect. It was meant to be a proving piece for both of them. A statement about what a house could be if you stripped away the pompous stucco facades and the mass-produced furniture, and the wallpaper that came in rolls from factories and started again from the beginning. The style was ahead of its time, a plain, honest early version of the vernacular architecture that would flourish at the end of the century. Built entirely in brick, hence the name, it was heavy, perhaps a little graceless from the outside, as if elegance had been deliberately set aside in favour of something sturdier. But inside, the severity was the setting for something extraordinary. Morris and his friends were going to decorate every surface by hand. Murals on the walls, patterns on the ceilings, tapestries on the hangings, stained glass in the windows. The whole house was going to be a work of art, lived in and slept in and cooked in and loved in, every day. Webb designed the furniture too. Massive oak tables, heavy chairs, cupboards built to last for centuries. There was a great settle that Morris and Ned had painted together back in their old Red Lion Square days, now installed in the first-floor drawing room, and Ned gave the Morrises a great wardrobe, decorated with scenes from Chaucer, as a wedding gift. Gabriel painted the panels of a cupboard with figures from Dante, showing Jane as Beatrice, with an inscription that read, "My lady carries love within her eyes." Everything in the house was made by hand, by people who knew each other, for a family that believed beautiful things should be part of daily life, not locked away in galleries and churches. Jane's own relationship to the house was complicated, as her relationship to everything in this new life was complicated. She'd grown up in a stableman's cottage in Oxford, and Red House, with its high ceilings and its multiple rooms and its requirement for servants, was a kind of world she'd only ever seen from the outside. Her one recorded practical comment about the design was that the coal cellar was too small, which tells you something about how she approached the project, not from the perspective of art or architecture, but from the perspective of someone who'd actually have to keep the fires going and the house warm through a Kent winter. It was the most useful thing anyone said about the plans, and it was almost certainly ignored. Georgie remembered the weeks she spent at Red House as a time to swear by, if human happiness were doubted, and you can feel it in the way she writes about those visits. The warmth, the laughter, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself. All friends and visitors were enlisted to help with the decorations, and the line between work and play dissolved entirely. In the mornings, the men climbed ladders and painted murals, filling the walls with scenes from medieval stories, their brushes leaving streaks of colour on their shirts and in their hair. The women sat together at the embroidery frame or at their engraving blocks, working more quietly but no less seriously, producing the hangings and panels that would transform bare walls into something that felt ancient and alive. Jane Morris was at the centre of this. She had discovered, with Morris's encouragement, a real talent for embroidery, not the delicate decorative needlework that well-bred ladies were taught as an accomplishment, but something stronger and more ambitious. Morris had started experimenting before they married, getting frames made, having worsted dyed to colours of his own choosing, and beginning a piece of work with his own hands. When Jane came along, he taught her the principles: how to lay the stitches closely so they covered the ground smoothly, how to radiate them properly, how to build up texture and depth. Together they studied old pieces, unpicking the stitches of medieval hangings to understand how they'd been made, learning by reverse engineering. It was uphill work, Jane remembered years later, but it was carried through by Morris's enormous energy and perseverance, and by her own, though she didn't say that part. Jane found the fabric herself, a piece of indigo-dyed blue serge, discovered by chance in a London shop. She brought it home and Morris was delighted, setting to work immediately designing flowers, simple stylised plants based on daisies, primroses and campions, flat and bold, and nothing like the fussy naturalistic florals that decorated most Victorian homes. These they worked in a simple, rough way, Jane wrote, and when it was finished they covered the walls of the bedroom at Red House to their great joy. The stitch was a basic couched running stitch, requiring no great technical skill, but producing an immediate handsome effect. And the curtains were worked almost entirely by Jane herself, with some help from visitors and her sister Bessie. Years later, faded but still serviceable, those hangings were still in place at Kelmscott Manor. There was a larger scheme too, a truly ambitious one. 12 full-size figures for the dining room walls, each one an illustrious woman from history and legend, with a tree between every pair and flowers at their feet, and patterns spreading across the whole background. It was meant to be a long-term project, a work of years, and it was. Jane wrote that during the slow progress of this gigantic work, they kept making experiments with silk and gold thread, learning techniques that would later bloom into the altar cloths and ceremonial hangings that Morris & Company produced commercially. Only 6 of the 12 figures were completed, or nearly so, before the Morrises left Red House. Bessie worked on some of them, and Georgie herself completed a panel showing Merlin and Morgan Le Fay, enchanter and enchantress, drawn toward each other and repelled, a theme that Ned returned to again and again in his paintings, and that perhaps said more about the relationships in this circle than anyone intended. It was out of all this making, the embroideries, the painted furniture, the stained glass, the hand-dyed fabrics, that the idea for a proper business emerged. If they could make these things for themselves, why not for others? The world was full of ugly machine-made furnishings. Surely there was a market for objects that were beautiful, well-crafted, and made by hand. In 1861, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company was founded, the firm as everyone called it, with Morris at the centre and Ned, Brown, Gabriel, Webb, Faulkner and the mathematician Peter Paul Marshall as founding partners. Each put in £1. The firm would make everything from wallpaper to tiles to furniture to stained glass windows, and it would change the way England thought about design. But in those first years, it was still more dream than business, still running at a loss, still fuelled by enthusiasm rather than profit. And the women's work, Jane's embroideries, Georgie's panels, was part of its foundation, even if the records didn't always say so. There's something I find deeply appealing about this, the idea of a house where the walls are covered with work your own hands made. Not bought, not ordered, not chosen from a catalogue, but made, stitch by stitch, over months, while sitting in a room with friends and listening to someone read aloud or tell a story. When you live with something you've made yourself, you see it differently. Every panel reminds you of the afternoon you worked on it, the conversation you were having, the light that was coming through the window. The house becomes a record of time spent together, a kind of diary written in thread and paint instead of ink. Georgie understood this. She'd grown up making things with her hands, sewing her own clothes, arranging music, cutting wood blocks, and at Red House she found a version of communal creativity that felt right to her, that matched something she'd always believed without quite having the words for it. Art didn't have to be solitary. It didn't have to belong to one person, locked in a studio behind a closed door. It could be shared, social, woven into the fabric of ordinary life, inseparable from the meals you ate and the games you played and the friends who slept in your spare room. In the afternoons, when the painting and stitching were done for the day, the women sometimes went out in the Red House wagonette, a little horse-drawn cart, sturdy and practical, and explored the Kent countryside. Georgie and Jane, side by side on the seat, with a map of Kent spread across their knees, navigating the lanes and finding villages with beautiful names, St Mary Cray, St Paul's Cray, that were then still genuinely rural, still untouched by the suburbs that would swallow them later in the century. The fields were green, the hedgerows thick, and the air was a world away from the smoke and soot of London. It must have felt like a holiday, even though it wasn't exactly. It was just life, lived in a place that happened to be beautiful. And in the evenings, everyone came together. The first-floor studio was used as a living and dining room during the decorating works, and Georgie described it as the most cheerful place, with windows looking three ways and a narrow slip of a window above the door through which you could see birds hopping on the roof. After supper, they played games, boisterous, childish games that made the house ring with the kind of noise that only happens when a group of clever adults decides to stop being clever for a while and just have fun. The jokes were often at Morris's expense, because his legendary temper made him the perfect target. On one occasion, Ned and Charlie Faulkner refused to speak to him at dinner except through Jane, which drove him into the kind of magnificent, sputtering rage that everyone found irresistible. He was easy to provoke and impossible to stay angry at, and the teasing was always affectionate, the way it is among people who know each other well enough to push. There's a painting that captures what those visits felt like, and it's one of the most beautiful things Ned ever made. It's called Green Summer, and it shows a group of young women sitting on the grass under the trees at Red House. One of them, the figure is based on Georgie, is reading aloud while the others listen, their faces calm and absorbed, their dresses spread around them on the lawn like fallen petals. The light is warm and even, the kind of light you get on a long English afternoon when the shadows haven't started to lengthen yet. Nobody in the painting is doing anything dramatic. Nobody is posing or performing. They're just being together, in a garden, in the summer, and that's enough. It's the simplest subject in the world, and Ned painted it with a tenderness that tells you he knew, even then, that it couldn't last. Georgie is in the painting, reading. Her sisters Aggie and Louie are there, and the green of the grass is the most saturated, most vivid green you've ever seen. The green of a particular place on a particular afternoon, remembered with the kind of intensity that only comes when you're looking back at something you've already lost. The painting was inspired by those family visits. Georgie bringing Phil and her sisters to stay, the women sitting in the orchard while the children played, the men painting upstairs, the whole household moving through its days with the easy rhythm of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. And it was during one of these visits that the conversation about the new wing became serious, that the dream of living together, of making Red House a permanent shared home, moved from idle talk to actual plans. Plans were drawn up. Philip Webb drew them, formal architectural plans on proper paper, for a new wing to be added to Red House. A wing for the Joneses. Georgie and Ned and little Phil would move in, and the two families would share the house, share the garden, share the life. The children would grow up together. The art would flow back and forth between the studios. The women would sit together at the embroidery frame in the mornings, and in the evenings everyone would eat at the same massive oak table. And it would be, in its own quiet way, a kind of utopia. A small, deliberate community built on the belief that people could live beautifully if they chose to. Georgie kept those plans, she never threw them away. 40 years later, looking at them in a drawer, the neat architectural lines, the room dimensions, the sketched garden paths, she wrote, with an understatement that barely conceals the ache beneath it, how different all our lives would have gone if this scheme had been carried out. It was never built. The reasons were practical. The firm was still struggling to make money. Morris's private income from his mining shares was dropping, and the financial ground was shifting beneath all of them. But there were other reasons too, quieter ones, harder to name. Things were changing between Jane and Morris. The warmth that had filled the early months of their marriage was cooling, slowly and privately, in ways that nobody talked about openly but everyone could sense. And by 1865 the Morrises had left Red House altogether, moved back to London, to a large house in Queen Square, Bloomsbury, where the firm's workshops occupied the ground floor and the family lived above. It was a descent in status. No garden, no carriage, much less space, and neither Morris nor Jane ever went back to Red House. The departure was too painful for that. Something had ended there, something that couldn't be recovered simply by walking through the door again. But I think what Georgie was really mourning, when she looked at those plans 4 decades later, wasn't just the house. It was the version of life that the house represented, the shared life, the communal creativity, the mornings at the embroidery frame and the evenings of hide-and-seek and the wagonette rides through the Kent lanes. The version where the door never closed, where art and domesticity weren't separated into his work and her work, but flowed together in a single stream, like the pattern on one of Morris's wallpapers, continuous, interconnected, making sense only as a whole. That version of life existed for a few summers, just a few, and then it was over, and everyone went back to their separate houses, their separate marriages, their separate struggles. But Georgie kept the plans. She kept them the way she kept everything. Folded, pressed, put away in a place where she could find them again when she needed to remember what had been possible. The orchard is dark now. The cherry trees stand still against the sky, their branches bare or heavy with fruit depending on the season you imagine. The brick walls of Red House hold the last warmth of the day, and somewhere inside a candle gutters in a window. The painted cupboards gleam in the low light. The embroidered hangings stir faintly in a draught that comes under the door, and in the drawing room, the great settle that Morris painted all those years ago in Red Lion Square sits against the wall, solid and patient, waiting for someone to sit down and stay. The baby came in the autumn of 1861. A boy, Philip. Phil, everyone called him from the start. And with his arrival, the world that Georgie had known split quietly in two. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing in Georgie's life ever happened all at once. It was always gradual, always understated, always announced with a precision that made it sound calmer than it was. But the division was real, and it was absolute. On one side of the door was the studio where Ned worked and friends visited, and the conversation flowed and the paintings took shape on the easel. On the other side was the nursery, or whatever room served as the nursery in their small flat, where Georgie sat with Phil on her knee listening. She described it herself years later in words that she must have turned over 1,000 times before committing them to paper. I had been used to be much with Edward, she wrote, reading aloud to him while he worked, and in many ways sharing the life of the studio. And I remember the feeling of exile with which I now heard through its closed doors the well-known voices of friends together with Edward's familiar laugh, while I sat with my little son on my knee and dropped selfish tears upon him. I need to stay with that for a moment, because there's so much packed into those words that it's easy to read past them without feeling the full weight, the feeling of exile, Not frustration, not anger, not resentment even. Exile, as if she'd been sent away from her own country, banished from the place where she belonged, and could hear the life of that country continuing without her, just on the other side of a door she was no longer allowed to open, and the tears she calls selfish. That word, selfish, is doing the heaviest lifting in the whole sentence. Because by calling her tears selfish, Georgie is telling you that she knew, even as she wept, that she had no right to weep. The baby needed her. The studio didn't. Her husband needed quiet to work, and his friends needed him, and the paintings that would pay the bills needed uninterrupted concentration. Her place was here, with Phil. Her tears were selfish because they were for herself, for the loss of something she'd valued. The companionship, the shared work, the sound of her own voice reading aloud while Ned painted, and a good mother, a proper mother, a mother who understood her duties would not have been crying about that. She would have been grateful. She would have been content. She would not have been sitting in a closed room, dropping tears on a baby who couldn't understand why his mother's face was wet. But Georgie was honest. That was always her defining quality. Not bravery, not rebellion, but a deep, steady, unflinching honesty about what she felt and what she saw. And what she saw in the spring of 1862 was that the door between her life and Ned's had closed, and that it had closed so naturally, so inevitably, that nobody had noticed it happening except her. It would be easy, from where we sit now, to blame Ned, to say he should have opened the door, should have brought the baby into the studio, should have shared the childcare so that Georgie could keep working on her engraving, keep reading aloud, keep being part of the world she'd married into. But that's not how the 1860s worked. It wasn't how anyone's mind worked, not even Georgie's. She didn't expect Ned to change. She didn't ask him to. The separation of mother and studio was as natural and inevitable to everyone involved as the separation of day and night. You didn't question it. You didn't resist it. You just felt it privately in the room where nobody could see you cry. The months that followed were anxious ones. When Phil was just 2 months old, Georgie took him to Manchester to meet her parents and her sisters. He was christened there, in deference to the MacDonald's Methodist faith, with Gabriel and Ruskin standing as godparents by proxy. An oddly grand arrangement for a baby whose parents had started their marriage with £30 and a deal table. From Manchester, they went to Birmingham to visit Ned's father and Miss Sampson, who fussed and worried and generally behaved as if Phil were the most fragile and important object in the world, which, to her, he was. Back in London for Christmas, Ned fell ill again. He'd always been physically fragile, thin, nervous, prone to the kind of collapses that came from pushing himself too hard and eating too little, and living on his nerves. On Christmas Eve he coughed blood. The fear was consumption, tuberculosis, which in the 1860s was essentially a death sentence. It wasn't tuberculosis, as it turned out, but nobody knew that immediately, and Georgie spent the holiday nursing a man who might be dying while caring for a baby who was himself unwell at the age of 4 months. Her job, as the book dryly puts it, was an anxious one. I think about that Christmas sometimes, the darkest time of the year, the shortest days, the cold creeping under the doors of their small flat, a baby who won't settle, a husband who's coughing blood into a handkerchief and trying to pretend it's nothing, and Georgie, moving between the two of them, the sick room and the nursery, the basin and the crib, holding everything together with the same quiet competence she'd learned in her mother's kitchen in Birmingham. Hannah had done this too. Hannah had nursed and managed and kept the household running while her husband was away. And Georgie was doing the same thing now. And the echo, there's that word again, echo, must have been almost unbearable. In May of 1862, Ruskin took Georgie and Ned to Italy. It was an extraordinary trip, funded entirely by Ruskin, who could afford such generosities and who genuinely wanted his young protégé to see the art of the Italian Renaissance firsthand. Georgie left Phil with one of her sisters, but Ruskin noted, with the casual condescension that came so naturally to him, that she seemed to see everything through a mist of baby. It was unfair. This was the same man who told her to keep her rooms tidy and baby happy, and Georgie's own letters from the trip tell a different story entirely. She wrote a long, entertaining account of a visit to Murano, the glass-blowing island near Venice, observing everything with the sharp, curious eye of a woman who hadn't been anywhere much and was determined to miss nothing. She was a good traveller. She was interested in what she saw. She noticed the colours of the glass, the movements of the glassblower's hands, the way the light fell through the workshop windows onto the molten material, the same kind of careful sensory attention she'd brought to everything since girlhood, and she wrote about it with her usual understated wit, aware of her own position as a minister's daughter from Birmingham, standing in a Venetian glass workshop, marvelling at a craft that was older than her entire country. And if she also missed her baby, well, that wasn't a flaw. That was just what it was like to be a mother who'd been told, by the most authoritative voice in England, that motherhood was her primary duty, and who'd taken that instruction to heart. And here's the cruelty of the timing, though nobody would have called it cruel at the time. Just as Georgie's world was contracting, shrinking down to the dimensions of a nursery and a kitchen, and the space between a crib and a wash basin, Ned's world was expanding. His reputation was growing. The commissions were coming in. People were beginning to notice him, to talk about his work, to invite him to dinners and exhibitions and the kind of gatherings where reputations are built and alliances formed. He was designing stained glass for churches, painting watercolours that sold for real money, producing the elaborate dreamlike compositions that would eventually make him one of the most famous artists in England. The select circle of friends that Georgie described in her letter to Ruskin, the circle that gathered around Ned in the evenings while she sat in the next room. That circle was getting larger, more distinguished, more demanding of his time and attention. And every step upward that Ned took was a step further away from her, not deliberately, not with any intention to hurt. But the logic was simple and merciless. The more important his work became, the more it required uninterrupted concentration. The more visitors came, the more the studio needed to be a serious professional space, not a room where a baby might cry or a wife might sit reading aloud. And the more Georgie was needed at home, to manage the household, to care for Phil, to handle the domestic machinery that kept the artist's life running, the less she was needed in the studio. The equation balanced itself, neatly and impersonally, and the result was a closed door. This wasn't unique to Georgie. It was the story of every artist's wife in this period, and every doctor's wife, and every lawyer's wife, and every clergyman's wife. The man's work expanded to fill the available space, and the woman's work contracted to fill the remainder. What was unique to Georgie was that she saw it happening, and she wrote about it with a clarity that most women of her generation either couldn't achieve or didn't dare attempt. She didn't dress it up in sentiment. She didn't pretend to be content. She simply said what was true, that she remembered the feeling of exile, and that she cried, and left the reader to draw their own conclusions. But the mist of baby that Ruskin noticed, if it was there at all, wasn't really about Phil. It was about the change in her position, her role, her relationship to the world she'd married into. Before Phil, Georgie had been a companion, a collaborator, a voice in the studio reading aloud while Ned worked. After Phil, she was a mother, and in the 1860s, mother was a category that excluded almost everything else. You couldn't be a mother and an artist. You couldn't be a mother and a partner. You could be a mother, and then, if there was time, you could do a little something on the side, some engraving, some music, some letter writing, as long as it didn't interfere with the real work of keeping the rooms tidy and the baby happy. She maintained her interest in Ned's work. She couldn't not. It was too much a part of her, too deeply woven into the fabric of her days and her identity. Later that year she wrote to Ruskin with a long, lively report on what Ned had been doing. He'd touched up Cupid and Psyche. Do you remember speaking slightingly of that young person's face? And taken out the sky and put it in again, and a few trifles of that nature which had wrought wonders. In the evenings, she reported, he sat in the midst of a select circle of friends, designing stained glass for the firm of Morris and Company. She described the Tristram and Iseult tiles, the Cinderella fireplace, the commissions that were starting to come in, the work that was beginning to matter. Her tone is proud, amused, engaged, the voice of a woman who understands what her husband is doing and can talk about it, with intelligence and wit. But notice what she's doing. She's reporting on his work. She's describing his evenings, his friends, his select circle. She's not in the circle. She's writing about it from the other side of the door, from the nursery or the kitchen or the small parlour where she sits alone after the baby's asleep, composing letters by candlelight to the most important art critic in England, about painting she can hear being discussed in the next room. Her sphere was undoubtedly narrowing. A few weeks after that letter, she wrote that she was poorly, having worn herself out by fidgets and anxieties about my boys, the plural telling you that Ned, with his fragile health and his nervous temperament, was as much her charge as Phil was. She was frequently the anxious sick nurse to both husband and son, moving between them with the calm, practical competence that was her inheritance from Hannah and the quiet desperation that was her own. And yet she didn't collapse. She didn't rage. She didn't, as far as anyone can tell, confront Ned or demand that things change. She simply absorbed the new reality, the way she'd absorbed every other reality that had been handed to her. The Methodist upbringing, the limited education, the long engagement, the £30, the broken necklace, the closed door. She absorbed it, and she kept going, and she found small ways to remain present in the world that was shutting her out. She wrote letters. She played the piano in the evenings when the baby was asleep. She kept up with the friends who visited, even if she could only see them briefly, between feedings, in the parlour rather than the studio. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't look like strength at all. It looks like patience. It looks like acceptance. It looks, from the outside, like a woman who's simply doing what women do. Keeping the household running, raising the child, supporting the husband, smiling when guests arrive and quietly clearing up after they leave. But underneath that surface there's something harder and more durable than anyone gives it credit for. There's the decision, made fresh every morning, to get up and do it again. To feed the baby and lay the fire and write the letter and play the piano and not cry. Or to cry quietly and quickly, and then wash your face and carry on. That's what Georgie did. Not because she was resigned, not because she didn't feel the loss, but because she was who she was. The girl who ate the mouse pie, the woman who kept the architectural plans, the person who, once she decided something, simply did it. And there were small comforts. There were always small comforts, if you knew how to find them. The weight of the baby in her arms, warm and solid and smelling of milk and clean linen. The sound of Ned's voice through the door, not the words, just the sound. The rise and fall of it, the familiar rhythm that she knew as well as her own breathing. The letters from her sisters, full of news and jokes and the practical sympathy of women who understood exactly what she was going through, because they were going through versions of it themselves. The piano, patient and available, waiting for the hours after dark when the house was quiet and her hands were free. She called her tears selfish, but I don't think they were. I think they were the most honest tears she ever cried. Honest about what she'd lost, honest about what she wanted, honest about the gap between the life she'd imagined and the life she'd been given. And I think the reason she remembered them so clearly, decades later, with such precise and unsparing detail, is that she knew they mattered. Not because they changed anything. They didn't. The door stayed closed. The exile continued. But the tears were proof that she had noticed. Proof that she hadn't simply accepted the arrangement as natural or inevitable or right. She'd felt the loss, and she'd named it, and she'd wept for it, and then she'd wiped her face and gone on holding the baby and listening to the laughter through the door. The house is quiet now. Phil is asleep finally, his small fist curled against the blanket. The studio door is closed, and behind it the voices have faded to murmurs and then to silence. Ned is still working, probably. He often works late by lamplight, when the daytime visitors have gone and the house is still. Georgie can see the thin line of light under the door. She watches it for a moment, this bright edge between her world and his, and then she turns away and settles into the chair and lets her eyes close. Tomorrow will be the same. The door will be closed, and the baby will need her, and the rooms will need tidying, and there will be no time or liking for the engraving tools in the drawer. But tonight she's too tired to mind. Tonight, the weight of the sleeping child is enough. It has to be. The house in Kensington Square was small, but it was warm, and it was theirs. After the cramped rented rooms and the years of moving from one temporary arrangement to the next, this felt like settling, like putting down roots for the first time, like saying this is where we live now, this is where the children will grow up, this is where we'll hang the curtains and lay the fires and receive the guests and do the slow, repetitive, necessary work of making a home. Kensington in the mid-1860s was becoming the painters' quarter. Holman Hunt was already established there. Other artists were moving in, drawn by the good light and the respectable addresses, and the fact that patrons found it easier to visit a studio in Kensington than to navigate the less fashionable reaches of Bloomsbury or Fitzroy Square. And Ned's career was rising. He was working hard, producing the stained glass designs and watercolours and elaborate compositions that were beginning to attract serious attention and serious money. The social circle was enlarging. Georgie's account of 1865 and 66 contains a long list of new acquaintances, neighbours and patrons, including the artist Birkett Foster and Henry Holliday, the Member of Parliament William Graham, and George and Rosalind Howard, who would eventually become the Earl and Countess of Carlisle. These were people of a different order from the young, broke, idealistic friends who'd shared cold suppers in Red Lion Square. These were people with influence and expectations, and entertaining them required a level of domestic organisation that Georgie had to learn as she went. And here's where the sewing machine comes in. It was a gift from G.F. Watts, a belated but much welcomed present, Georgie called it, and it changed her domestic life in a way that's hard to appreciate now, when sewing machines are ordinary objects that sit in closets and come out for hems and curtains. In the 1860s, a sewing machine was a small revolution. Before it, every garment in the household, every shirt, every nightgown, every set of children's clothes, every curtain and tablecloth and pillowcase had to be cut and stitched entirely by hand. That was hours of work, days of work, weeks of work if you counted it all up over a year, and Georgie, who had been sewing since childhood, who had made her own clothes and her sister's clothes and probably her trousseau too, now had a machine that could do in an hour what used to take an afternoon. Ned wrote about it with a kind of boyish delight that makes you smile. The little machine, he told someone, almost made the garments by itself. And you can picture him standing in the doorway of whatever room Georgie had set the machine up in, watching her feed fabric through this mechanism, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the needle, marvelling at the speed of it the way he marvelled at everything mechanical and practical. The things that Georgie understood instinctively, and that always slightly amazed him, because his own world was paint and line, and the slow, painstaking construction of images, and the idea that a machine could turn a flat piece of cloth into a finished shirt in the time it took him to sketch. A hand was genuinely wonderful to him. I think about what that machine meant to Georgie, though, and it's something different from what it meant to Ned. For Ned, it was a charming novelty. His wife had a clever new tool that made the domestic work go faster, which meant the household ran more smoothly, which meant he could concentrate on painting without worrying about whether the children had clean clothes. For Georgie, it was time. Not much time. The sewing machine didn't eliminate housework, it just compressed it. But enough time, perhaps, to read a chapter of a book before the baby woke up, or to sit at the piano for half an hour in the afternoon, or to write a letter to Ruskin or to one of her sisters without feeling guilty about the pile of mending she should have been doing instead. The sewing machine was the Victorian equivalent of any labour-saving device. It didn't free you, but it gave you a little more room to breathe inside the cage. Then there was the account book. This is one of those small, specific details that tells you everything about how the household actually functioned, and it's worth spending a moment with. The Joneses kept an account book with Morris & Company, the firm, which allowed them to order household goods like furnishing fabric and wine through the business, with the cost set against the amounts that Ned earned for his stained glass designs and tile work. It was a kind of barter system, elegant and practical. Ned designed a set of windows for a church, and instead of receiving all the payment in cash, the equivalent value was credited to the family's account, and Georgie could order fabric for curtains or a case of wine for entertaining without actually spending money they didn't have. There's something wonderfully intimate about an account book. It tells you what people actually bought, what they actually needed, what their daily life was actually made of. And when you look at the Joneses' account with Morris & Company, you see a household that was comfortable but not lavish. A household where the curtains were made from Morris's own fabrics, where the wine came through the firm's suppliers, where the aesthetic life and the practical life were intertwined in the most literal way possible. Ned's art paid for the fabric that Georgie sewed on the machine that Watts gave her. The beauty that Morris designed ended up on the windows of their house, and the money that paid for it came from the beauty that Ned designed for someone else's church. Everything circled back to making and making do. Georgie took no financial responsibility by her own later admission. "I know now that Edward had more anxiety about money in those early days than I realised," she wrote, "for it was not a subject he talked much about, and it never occurred to me that we should not have our wants supplied. It's an honest admission, and a revealing one. Georgie, the minister's daughter, the girl who'd grown up counting every shilling, had somehow absorbed the artist's wife's prerogative of not thinking about money. Perhaps it was because the money came from Ned's work, and his work was a thing she'd been taught to admire and support rather than manage. Perhaps it was because the account book made it feel as though everything was taken care of. The fabric arrived, the wine arrived, the household ran, and the mechanism that made it all possible was invisible, like the mechanism inside the sewing machine. But she ran the house, make no mistake about that. Whatever she didn't know about the family's finances, she knew everything about its daily operations. She managed the cooking and the cleaning and the children's routines. She hired and supervised whatever help they could afford. A cook, perhaps, a maid, the kind of modest domestic establishment that a rising artist's household required. She organised the entertaining, which was becoming more frequent and more demanding as Ned's reputation grew. And she did it all with the calm, understated efficiency that was her hallmark. The same efficiency her mother had brought to the minister's household, stretched now over a larger stage and a more complicated cast of characters. With her nonconformist background, Georgie was firmer in despising worldly things. That's how she put it, looking back with characteristic precision. She meant that Ned was being beguiled by the glamour of success, by the patrons and the dinner invitations and the sense of moving upward through a social world that valued reputation and connections as much as it valued art. And she wasn't wrong. Ned did enjoy it. He enjoyed being noticed, being praised, being invited to houses where the furniture was real mahogany, and the wine was better than anything that came through the firm's account book. He'd grown up poor, poorer than Georgie, in many ways, the only child of a struggling tradesman, and the experience of upward mobility, combined with the memory of early insecurity, made him hungry for the kind of success that came with tangible rewards. He wanted the recognition. He wanted the commissions. He wanted perhaps the feeling of having left his father's shop behind for good. Georgie watched this with the same quiet, observant attention she brought to everything. She didn't interfere. She didn't lecture. But her Methodist inheritance, the belief that simplicity was a virtue and that worldly success was at best a distraction, and at worst a corruption, sat uneasily alongside Ned's growing appetite for the finer things. She'd grown up in a house where 2 shillings and sixpence a week was a serious expenditure, where every penny was accounted for, where the highest praise was to be called useful rather than brilliant. And now she was living in a world where brilliance was the currency and usefulness was invisible, and the gap between those two value systems was widening with every new patron who knocked on the door. The house in Kensington Square became a gathering place, not in the grand, formal way of the Browns' regular gatherings at Fitzroy Square, where there were proper invitations and proper seating, and the kind of social architecture that Emma Brown managed with formidable skill. The Joneses' hospitality was more intimate, more improvised. Friends dropping in, staying for supper, sleeping on the sofa if they'd been out too late to get home. William Allingham was the most frequent of these overnight guests. He'd been briefly engaged to Georgie's older sister Alice, the same Alice who'd burned the Wesley relic. And though the engagement came to nothing, the friendship endured. Allingham had a habit of spending his evenings with Gabriel and Swinburne at Cheyne Walk, where the wine flowed freely and the conversation ran late, and then making his way across London in the small hours to the Joneses' front door. On the 31st of July, 1866, Allingham arrived at 3 a.m, having spent the evening with Gabriel and Swinburne, and slept on the sofa. Not comfortably, he noted in his diary, with the dry precision of a man who keeps a record of everything, and you can picture it. Allingham letting himself into the quiet house, finding a blanket, trying not to wake the children, settling his long frame onto a sofa that was built for sitting, not sleeping, and lying there in the dark, listening to the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards overhead, where Georgie and Ned and the children were asleep. The Joneses' sofa, by this point, must have known the shape of Allingham's body almost as well as it knew Georgie's. He was practically furniture himself. What I find touching about this is the ordinariness of it. The Kensington house wasn't grand. The hospitality wasn't lavish. It was just open. The door was unlocked, literally or figuratively, for friends who needed a place to sleep, a meal to eat, a few hours of conversation before heading back to their own studios and their own work. And Georgie was the one who made that possible. She was the one who kept the spare blankets accessible and the pantry stocked and the house in a state where someone could arrive at 3 a.m. and find a place to rest. It was invisible work, as it always had been. The kind of work that people notice only when it stops being done. On the back of the first household account book, Ned had drawn two little figures, a private joke, a tiny piece of art tucked inside the machinery of domestic life. It's such a small detail, but it tells you that even in the account book, even in the driest and most practical document in the household, Ned couldn't resist making something. And Georgie, turning the pages to check the entries and the balances, would have seen those little drawings every time, and known that the man who made them was the same man whose laughter she could hear through the studio door, and whose shirts she was sewing on the machine that Watts had given her, and whose career was rising and rising while her own world stayed exactly the same size. Margaret was born in June of 1866, a daughter, much loved from the first moment, and with her arrival the household in Kensington Square was complete. 2 children, a working artist, a sewing machine, an account book with Morris and Company, a sofa that Allingham slept on, and Georgie at the centre of it all, keeping everything running with a competence so quiet that most people never noticed it was there. She was 25, she felt older. Something had shifted in her, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way that a foundation shifts when the ground beneath it settles. The girlish excitement of the engagement years, the shared intimacy of the studio, the Red House summers, those belonged to a different person, or at least to a different chapter. This was the chapter of the sewing machine and the account book, of the sofa and the spare blankets, of the children's shoes that needed resoling, and the curtains that needed hemming, and the wine that needed ordering through the firm. It was a life of small, useful, repetitive acts, performed with care and without complaint, in a house that was warm and clean, and full of the particular kind of love that expresses itself not in grand gestures, but in the daily, unglamorous business of keeping things going. In November of 1867 they moved again, this time to the Grange, a large old house in North End Lane, Fulham. It was bigger than anything they'd had before, with proper rooms for the children and space for Ned's expanding studio, and a garden where Phil could run around without being taken to a park. Georgie described the move with a phrase that catches in the throat. "We finally put away childish things," she wrote, "and had our share of sorrow." It's a strange thing to say about a house. But the Grange was the house where the marriage would be tested, where the strains that had been building quietly since the early days would finally surface, and Georgie knew it, looking back, even if she couldn't have known it at the time. The household grew complicated. For the first year the Grange was shared with Ned's old school friend Wilfred Healy, the same Wilfred who couldn't eat the mouse pie, and his second wife Josephine, who added to the strain by having an unplanned baby under Georgie's roof. Then Georgie's sister Alice Kipling arrived from India to have her own second child, and stayed for half a year. Then Georgie's long-lost brother Harry turned up from America with his wife, bringing their mother Hannah with him. The house was full, constantly, of people who needed feeding and managing and accommodating, and Georgie, who had never had a large house to run and was learning as she went, managed it all with a competence that must have cost her more than she ever showed. And then there was Inchbold, the painter J.W. Inchbold, who billeted himself uninvited on the Joneses in the middle of all this, simply turning up and staying, the way people did in that era when hospitality was understood as a duty rather than a choice. Georgie's housekeeping and hospitality, the record notes with admirable restraint, must have been strained to the limit. Must have been. The passive construction tells you everything. Nobody asked Georgie how she felt about it, and she didn't volunteer the information. She just laid another place at the table and found another set of sheets. The fire is banked. The account book is closed, its little drawings hidden between the covers. The sewing machine stands quiet in the corner, its needle still, its thread wound neatly on the spool. Somewhere in the house, a child turns in sleep and settles again. And Georgie, in the kitchen or the parlour or whichever room she's ended up in at the end of the day, sits for a moment with her hands in her lap, doing nothing, thinking about nothing, letting the silence gather around her like a blanket. Tomorrow there will be more to do. There is always more to do. But tonight, the house is still, and the children are safe, and the sofa is empty for once, and that's enough. In the summer of 1866, cholera was reported in London. The disease moved through the city the way it always did, silently, along the waterways and through the crowded courts, killing the poor first and then working its way upward through the social strata, with a kind of democratic indifference that terrified everyone regardless of class. Margaret had just been born in June, and the thought of a newborn baby in a city where cholera was spreading must have been more than Georgie could bear calmly. So when William Allingham invited the whole family to the New Forest, offering to find them lodgings and promising clean air and green trees, and the kind of quiet that London hadn't seen in months, Georgie said yes. On the 15th of August, the four Joneses, Ned, Georgie, Phil and tiny Margaret, travelled south to Hampshire, to the lodgings that Allingham had arranged for them. And this is where the story gets gentle. Because what follows, recorded in Allingham's diary with the meticulous attention to detail that was his particular gift, is a picture of a family on holiday. Not a grand holiday, not a fashionable seaside resort or a rented villa in Italy, but a simple, unhurried few weeks in the New Forest, doing nothing much, doing it slowly, doing it together. Allingham kept a diary. He was the kind of man who noticed everything and wrote it all down. The weather, the trees, the path they took, the book they were reading, the insects hovering over the brook. His entries for those August days read like a walk through a painting, each detail placed with care, each moment given its proper weight. On the 18th of August, Allingham records that he and Ned and Georgie walked to Brockenhurst. Field path, stiles, Ober Green, heather. The landscape unfolds in his shorthand like a map. They reach Queen's Bower and sit by the little bridge. There's an Oakenshaw nearby, that old word for a small oak wood, with big oaks and a brook, and insects moving over the water, and a great beech tree spreading its canopy overhead. Ned sketches, and Allingham reads aloud Robin Hood and the Monk. The New Forest itself is a particular kind of landscape. Not wild exactly, not dramatic, but old. It had been a royal hunting ground since the days of William the Conqueror, and the trees there have the patient, unhurried look of things that have been growing in the same place for centuries. The oaks spread wide and low, their branches heavy with age. The beeches stand tall and smooth, their bark silvery in the morning light. The heather covers the open ground in late summer with a faint purple haze that smells faintly sweet, like honey mixed with earth. And the ponies, the New Forest ponies that have grazed there since before anyone can remember, stand by the road and watch you pass with an expression of mild and curious calm, as if they've seen everything and found none of it particularly impressive. For Georgie, this was the first real holiday she'd had since Margaret was born. The baby was barely 2 months old, and the decision to travel with two small children, Phil would have been nearly 5, must have required the kind of logistical planning that only a mother understands. Nappies, bottles, changes of clothes, blankets, the particular toys that Phil couldn't sleep without, the particular way that Margaret needed to be held to stop her crying. All of this packed into cases and loaded onto a train, while Georgie kept track of everything and Ned probably carried the sketchbook and not much else. But once they arrived, once the lodgings were settled and the trunks unpacked and the children's routines adjusted to the new surroundings, something loosened. The air was different. The light was different. The constant background noise of London, the carriages, the street vendors, the neighbours, the knock at the door that meant another guest or another commission or another demand on Ned's time. All of it fell away, and what was left was bird song and wind and the sound of water moving over stones. I want to stay here for a moment, by a brook, in a forest, in the middle of August. The light is coming through the trees in that particular way it does in late summer, when the leaves are at their thickest and the sun has to work to get through, and everything is dappled and warm and slightly golden. Ned is drawing in his sketchbook, his hand moving quickly over the paper, catching the shape of the trees or the curve of the bridge, or maybe just the way the light falls on the water. Allingham is reading aloud, and notice who's doing the reading this time. Not Georgie. Allingham. For once, Georgie isn't the one providing the voice. She's the one listening, sitting by the brook with her shoes off perhaps, or her skirt spread on the grass, hearing the words of an old English ballad read in a friend's voice while her husband draws, and the insects hum over the water, and nobody needs anything from her at all. I think that might be the most restful image in this whole story. Georgie not reading. Georgie not sewing. Georgie not managing the household or nursing a sick husband or feeding a baby, or laying a fire or finding a blanket for Allingham's sofa. Just sitting. Just listening. Just being a person by a brook on a summer afternoon, with nothing to do, and nowhere to be, and nobody's needs pressing against her like hands. I think about what it must have meant for Georgie to walk through those meadows with Morris, not as a wife trailing behind her husband's friend, but as a companion, a fellow walker, a person whose company Morris actively sought and valued. Morris had a way of talking to Georgie that was different from how he talked to anyone else in the circle. He was gentler with her, more attentive, more willing to slow down and match her pace. Years later, he would write to her that the two of them were in the same box, meaning that they both loved people who couldn't quite love them back in the way they needed, and that this shared understanding bound them together in a way that went deeper than friendship. But that letter was still years away. On this afternoon in Winchester, walking by the water meadows, they were just two people who liked each other's company, moving through a beautiful place at the pace of conversation. On the 30th of August, the group took the train to Winchester. Ned, Georgie, Allingham, and Webb, Philip Webb, the architect who'd designed Red House, met Morris there. All of them walked together by the close and the meadows to St. Cross, the ancient almshouse on the edge of the city. Winchester in late August is soft and slow, the cathedral city drowsing in the heat, the water meadows spreading flat and green along the river, the light falling in that particular Hampshire way that makes everything look slightly older and more peaceful than it actually is. They walked, that's all. They walked through a beautiful place with people they loved, and nobody was in a hurry, and the meadows were full of late summer wildflowers, and the cathedral tower rose above the trees in the distance like something out of one of Ned's paintings. The next day, the 31st, they hired a carriage from the Nag's Head and drove to the sea at Milford. The whole group this time, Ned, Georgie, Morris, Phil, Allingham, and presumably baby Margaret with them, though Allingham's diary doesn't say so. The beach at Milford was shingle, not sand, but the rounded grey pebbles that the English Channel deposits on the Hampshire coast, smooth and heavy and warm from the sun. Morris and Ned sprawled on the beach and refused to walk. They simply lay there on the stones, two grown men in their heavy Victorian clothes, doing absolutely nothing, while the waves came in and went out and the seagulls wheeled overhead. And then they buried Morris. Allingham records it with perfect deadpan precision. We bury Morris up to the neck in shingle. Just like that. No explanation, no preamble, no discussion of why a group of adults would decide on a perfectly pleasant afternoon at the seaside to bury one of their number up to his chin in pebbles. They just did it. And Morris, who had a temper like a furnace, and a body that couldn't stay still for more than 10 minutes at a time, apparently lay there and let them, his great bearded head sticking up out of the stones like some improbable natural formation, while the others piled shingle around him and laughed. You know what gets me about that image? It's the trust. Morris trusting his friends enough to lie still while they covered him in stones. And Georgie, because she must have been there, she must have been part of it, her hands scooping up the warm grey pebbles and packing them around Morris's shoulders. Georgie being, for one afternoon, not a wife or a mother or a household manager, but just a friend on a beach, doing something completely pointless and completely wonderful. I think that's what holidays are for. Not the sightseeing, not the improving walks through cathedral towns, but the moments when the rules fall away and you find yourself burying a large bearded man in shingle for no reason at all and laughing so hard that the seagulls scatter. And then there's the baby. On the 5th of September, as the Joneses were packing up to leave, Allingham records one last scene. Baby Margaret has fallen asleep on the large bed. And Ned, the painter, the man of beautiful and serious things, the man who spent his days making images of medieval knights and classical heroines, has arranged his daughter into a grotesque giantese. He's placed gloves and shoes at great distances from her tiny sleeping body, so that it looks as though her hands and feet are enormous, extending out across the bed in all directions, a baby transformed into a comical monster by the strategic placement of adult accessories. Allingham notes it with evident amusement, and you can hear the laughter in the room, the quiet, helpless laughter of people who've been on holiday together for 3 weeks and have reached that state of exhaustion and affection where the smallest joke becomes the funniest thing anyone has ever seen. There's something about Ned in this moment that I find enormously appealing and a little sad, because this is the same man who couldn't get through his own wedding without losing his voice. The same man who spent his days in a studio behind a closed door producing paintings of such intense, withdrawn beauty that they seem to exist in a world without laughter or mess, or the smell of salt air. And here he is, on a bed in a rented room in the New Forest, playing with his daughter's sleeping body like a child arranging dolls, making his friends laugh with the simplest and silliest of jokes. He could be silly. He could be playful. He could, when the studio door was open and the world was small enough and safe enough, be the kind of father and friend that makes a room feel warm just by being in it. It's just that those moments were rare and getting rarer, and Georgie knew it. And perhaps that's why the image of the grotesque giantess, so small, so silly, so temporary, stays in the story like a pressed flower between the pages of a book. Back in London, the world was different. There was a party at Cheyne Walk, Gabriel's house, the great rambling place in Chelsea, where he kept his menagerie of exotic animals and his collection of blue china and his paintings propped against every wall. It was a large gathering, one of the first big social events that Georgie attended in this period, and the guest list was long. William Rossetti, the Browns with Lucy and Katie, Jane and Morris, Georgie's sister Aggie, Bell Scott, the sculptor Munro and his wife Stevens, the artist Legros with his pretty English wife Webb, and Swinburne. It was the whole circle, or nearly, assembled in one house for an evening. Georgie wore her Chinese blue silk dress. This was clearly something she valued. A beautiful thing, perhaps the most beautiful thing she owned. The kind of garment that a minister's daughter, who'd married on £30, doesn't acquire often. Chinese blue silk. You can see the colour in your mind. That deep, lustrous blue that's almost black in shadow and catches the light in folds of extraordinary richness. She must have put it on carefully, must have looked at herself in the mirror and felt for one evening, not like a household manager in a sewing machine apron, but like a woman who belonged in a room full of artists and their beautiful wives. And then Emma Brown spilled coffee on it. A whole cup down the front of the dress, the dark liquid spreading across the blue silk in a stain that couldn't be fixed. Georgie's sister Aggie recorded the incident with the kind of controlled outrage that only a family member can manage. Mrs. Brown, who was otherwise very nice, spilled a cup of coffee down Georgie's Chinese blue silk dress, and for this we don't thank her, for time can never restore that dress or another like it. And then, as if Providence itself had decided to make the evening complete, a waiter upset a milk jug on Georgie as she was leaving the room to clean herself up. Coffee and milk one after the other on the one good dress. There's something about this incident that goes beyond a ruined garment. Emma Brown was struggling. She'd been married to Ford Maddox Brown for years, had borne his children and run his household, and fed strangers from her own soup kitchen when there wasn't enough money for both charity and comfort. And somewhere along the way, the weight of it all had become too much, and she'd started drinking. It was noted quietly by the people around her. Brown's own diary recorded with painful brevity instances of difficulty and arguments that followed, and whole days lost to remonstrations. The coffee spill may have been an accident. It may have been the unsteady hand of a woman who'd had too much wine before the coffee was served. Either way, it was Emma's trouble landing on Georgie's dress, one woman's struggle marking another woman's one beautiful thing. And Georgie went home in a stained dress, and probably washed it and tried to save it and couldn't, and put it away, and that was that. She didn't complain, as far as anyone recorded. She didn't blame Emma. She simply absorbed the loss, the way she absorbed everything, quietly, without fuss, with the particular kind of patience that comes from knowing that a dress is just a dress, and that the evening, for all its disasters, was still an evening spent with friends in a room full of paintings and talk, and that there were worse things in the world than coffee on silk. It's late now. The New Forest is a long way away, and the shingle beach at Milford, and the brook where Allingham read Robin Hood while Ned sketched, and Georgie sat and listened and didn't have to be anything for anyone. Those afternoons exist now only in a diary and in the memory of the people who were there, and most of them won't talk about them much because that's how the Victorians are. They hold their happiness close, the way they hold their grief privately in rooms where nobody else can see. But the image is there. Morris buried in pebbles laughing, Margaret asleep on the bed, her tiny body extended into absurdity by her father's gentle joke. Georgie by the brook, listening. These small, warm, weightless moments, scattered through a life that was mostly duty and endurance and the steady ticking of the sewing machine. They don't change anything. They don't fix anything. But they're there, like stones in the pocket, smooth and heavy and real. The years that followed were the hardest of Georgie's life, and she said almost nothing about them. What she did say, she said with that precise, measured understatement that was her way of controlling things that couldn't be controlled. the careful language of a woman who knew that if she dropped her reserve she would break down completely. She told her friend Rosalind Howard exactly that, in so many words, and then she went on holding herself together, day after day, in a house that was quietly falling apart. We don't need to follow every detail of what happened between Ned and Georgie during those years. What matters for tonight is what Georgie did with the pain, how she took the worst thing that had happened to her and slowly, stubbornly, without drama or self-pity, turned it into the foundation of a life that was entirely her own. She wrote to Rosalind in February of 1869, disclaiming heroism and refusing to apportion blame. "May we all come well through it at last," she prayed, and the word prayed is right, even for a woman who'd given up religion, because there's something devotional in that sentence, something that reaches toward a source of strength beyond the self. And then she said the thing that still catches in the throat, more than a century and a half later. "I know one thing," she wrote, "and that is that there is enough love between Edward and me to last out a long life, if it is given to us. Enough love. Not overflowing love, not passionate love, not the love of the Red Lion Square evenings and the troubadour songs and the reading aloud in the studio, just enough. Enough to hold, enough to build on, enough to keep two people in the same house, raising the same children, sharing the same table, even when the marriage had bent so far that most people would have expected it to break. And it didn't break. That's the thing about Georgie. She held it. Not because she was weak, and not because she was strong in the way that word usually means. Not brave, not defiant, not the heroine of a story about a woman who fights back. She held it because she had made a decision, early and quietly and without fanfare, that this was her life, and she was going to live it, and that the love she had, imperfect, insufficient, tested, was still real and still worth preserving. There was a sad New Year letter to her sister Louie, written on an evening when Georgie was alone. She described having only a lonely peck at her supper and said that Christmas had been very quiet with no merrymaking. Her resolution for the New Year was schooled. She wished she might never say another harsh thing or an uncharitable one. And she added, with the kind of fragile hope that's almost worse than despair, that she hoped she might have another baby but was not too sanguine. It's the most exposed thing she ever wrote, as far as the record shows. The loneliness, the hunger for comfort, the desire for a child that would give her something new to love in a house where the love she already had wasn't quite enough. But Georgie was not entirely alone. Two friendships sustained her through these years, and both of them mattered enormously, though in different ways. The first was with Marian Evans, George Eliot. They'd been introduced through the artistic circle, and the friendship deepened during the late 1860s into something that Georgie valued beyond almost anything else in her life. George Eliot was, in many ways, the opposite of everything Georgie had been raised to be. She lived openly with a married man, George Henry Lewis, in an arrangement that placed her firmly outside the boundaries of respectable Victorian society. She was brilliant, independent, famous, and unapologetic. She'd made choices that a minister's daughter from Birmingham could never have made, and she'd paid the social price without flinching. And Georgie, who had absorbed the Victorian code of respectability with her mother's milk, who had never openly rebelled against anything, who had eaten the mouse pie but never burned the Wesley relic. Georgie loved her. There's something deeply touching about this friendship. The respectable artist's wife and the scandalous novelist, sitting together in George Eliot's drawing room, talking about books and ideas and the things that mattered to them both. George Eliot was a good and supportive friend, Georgie wrote, with characteristic understatement. What she meant was that George Eliot saw her, saw through the competent surface and the careful manners and the stiff upper lip, and recognised the intelligence and the moral seriousness and the hunger for a larger life that Georgie had been carrying since childhood. In George Eliot's company, Georgie wasn't just an artist's wife. She was a person with her own mind, her own opinions, her own worth, and when George Eliot died, Georgie didn't let the connection end. Years later, she persuaded Eliot's widower to donate some of her friend's works to the South London Gallery, the Dear Struggling Gallery, Georgie called it, and the phrase has the warmth of someone describing a child they've raised. She was building a bridge between the woman who'd seen her most clearly and the community she'd chosen to serve, and there's something beautifully right about that. George Eliot's books on the walls of a gallery in Camberwell, put there by the minister's daughter who'd loved them both. The second friendship was with Morris, and this one went deeper, in some ways, than any other relationship in Georgie's life. deeper perhaps than her marriage, though she would never have said so and might not have believed it even if she'd thought it. Morris's sympathy was aroused by Georgie's self-command. That's how the record puts it, and the phrase is carefully chosen. Self-command, not suffering, not stoicism. Self-command, the active, deliberate maintenance of composure in circumstances that would have broken most people. Morris saw it, and it moved him, and he responded with a tenderness that was unlike anything else in his character. Morris was a man of rages and enthusiasms, a man who kicked panels out of doors when he was angry and threw himself into new projects with the force of a small avalanche. Gentleness didn't come naturally to him, but with Georgie, it did. While abroad, he thought of the Grange. "Tell me how things go on there," he wrote to Philip Webb from Ghent, and the phrase tells you that Morris was watching over Georgie from a distance, the way you watch over someone you can't help but worry about. In the same city, he celebrated Georgie's birthday by buying her a pair of Delft Kroot bottles. Simple, beautiful objects, blue and white, the kind of thing that sits on a kitchen table and gives pleasure every time you reach for the salt. He sent them to Webb with instructions to have new silver lids fitted, and then presented, "Give them to her with my love," he wrote, "when what is necessary is alone." That last phrase is cryptic, but the feeling behind it is clear. Morris wanted to give Georgie something beautiful, and he wanted it to arrive at the right moment, when it would matter most. "We two are in the same box." That's what Morris wrote to Georgie, in a marginal note on a poem about sitting alone and unhappy by a fire, thinking of someone else's sadness. The note reads like a confession, and a plea at the same time. "We two are in the same box and need conceal nothing. Don't cast me away. Scold me, but pardon me." They were both, he meant, married to people who'd turned toward someone else. They were both sitting alone by fires on cold evenings, thinking of someone who was elsewhere, wondering how the life they'd planned had turned into the life they had. And the recognition of that shared position, the honest, unadorned acknowledgement that they understood each other's pain, became the foundation of a love that lasted the rest of their lives. It wasn't a romance. I want to be clear about that, because the Victorians have a way of being misread, and the temptation to turn every deep friendship into a love affair is strong. What Morris and Georgie had was something rarer and I think more valuable, a mutual seeing. He saw her steadiness and her courage and her quiet, unshakable integrity, and he loved her for it. She saw his struggle for self-control, his pain, his fundamental decency beneath all the bluster and the rage, and she loved him for it. And together, brought to the same quiet place by circumstances neither of them had chosen, they refused to indulge in displays of grief or recrimination. She chose instead to keep going, to endure, and to help each other endure, with a dignity that neither of them could have managed alone. And then, slowly, over the years that followed, Georgie began to build something new. Not a new marriage. The old one held, imperfect and scarred, but intact. Something else. A life of her own. She threw herself into philanthropy. The South London Art Gallery became her great project, a gallery for the working people of Camberwell, free to enter, open on Sundays when the workers were actually free to visit, in a neighbourhood that one of its founders described as a great intellectual desert, with miles of flat, ugly homes and absolutely no public buildings. The gallery had started small, with lectures and a free reading library and art exhibitions in borrowed rooms. In the early days, the local children threw cabbage stumps at the organisers and swore at them in the street. But Georgie persisted. She canvassed her friends for donations. She helped raise £10,000 to build a permanent home for the gallery on Peckham Road. She negotiated the complex transfer of the gallery to local authority control when it outgrew its volunteer management, insisting that it be maintained as a free picture gallery for the inhabitants of South London, open on Sundays forever. The word forever was Georgie's. She wrote it into the agreement. Ned, it must be said, was not entirely supportive. He called Camberwell a seemingly needless neighbourhood, and joked about the miserable journey to get there. He confided to his assistant that there had been times when he had cursed the gallery up and down, but kept it to himself so as not to discourage Georgie. It's a telling remark, half exasperated, half admiring, the complaint of a man who knows his wife is doing something important, and wishes she'd stop because it makes him uncomfortable. Georgie ignored him. She had spent years supporting his work. Now she had work of her own, and she wasn't going to give it up because the journey to Camberwell was inconvenient. She became a parish councillor in Rottingdean, the seaside village near Brighton where the family had a holiday home. Parish councils were new bodies, created under the Local Government Act, and women were permitted both to vote and to stand. It was a small stage, a village council in Sussex, not Parliament, not the great campaigns for women's suffrage that were gathering force elsewhere. But it was real power, exercised by a real woman in a real community, making decisions about roads and drains and street lighting and all the unglamorous infrastructure that actually shapes people's daily lives. And Georgie took it seriously, the way she took everything seriously. The same focused attention, the same quiet competence, the same refusal to be deterred by opposition, or boredom, or the polite condescension of men who thought they knew better. Ruskin should have been proud. I keep thinking about that, about the irony of it. The man who told Georgie to keep her rooms tidy and baby happy, who described her engraving as having just the proper quality of echo, who'd instructed her never to work hard at her art. That man should have been proud to see the determination and self-effacement with which his ideals were put into practice by the woman he'd patronised all those years before. Ruskin had preached about bringing art to the people. Georgie actually did it. Her gallery during the 1890s welcomed over 100,000 visitors a year. Workers and their families from the streets of South London, people who had nothing to look at, as Rossiter put it, but the outsides of rows of ugly buildings and the insides of public houses. And Georgie brought them paintings, and a reading room, and a lecture hall, and the simple radical idea that beauty was something everyone deserved, not just the people who could afford an entrance fee. She possessed neither conceit nor personal ambition. That's how the record describes her, and I believe it. She didn't want recognition. She didn't want her name on a plaque. She wanted the gallery to exist, and to be open, and to be free, and to be there on Sunday afternoons when the working people of Camberwell had nowhere else to go. And she wanted it to last. That's why she wrote forever into the agreement, not as a flourish, but as a binding clause. She'd learned by now that the things you don't nail down have a way of being quietly removed. In Rottingdean, she delivered Morris's pamphlets on art and society to the village households, and the villagers were not always grateful. But Georgie kept delivering them, the way she kept doing everything, steadily, without expectation of thanks, with the stubborn patience of a woman who's been told her whole life that her efforts don't really matter, and has decided quietly and finally that they do. And there, I think, is where we find the quiet strength that this chapter is named for. Not in any single act of courage or defiance, not in a dramatic confrontation or a breaking free, but in the slow, patient, undramatic accumulation of a life that mattered. A life built out of the things that were available to her. The things that nobody had thought to take away, because nobody had thought they were important enough to take. The gallery, the council, the friendships, the children, grown now, finding their own paths. The Delft cruet bottles on the kitchen table, blue and white, with their new silver lids, reaching for the salt every morning with hands that had sewn 1,000 garments and cut 100 wood blocks and played Beethoven on a hired piano in a cold studio a long time ago. Morris had said they were in the same box, but Georgie had found her way out, not by leaving the box, but by filling it with something that was hers, something useful, something real, something that would still be standing in Camberwell, open to the public on Sunday afternoons, long after everyone in this story had gone quiet. The fire has burned to embers, the house is still. The children are grown and sleeping in their own houses, their own beds, with their own lives unfolding in ways that Georgie can watch, but no longer shape. The piano is closed. The sewing machine is still. The account book with Morris and Company has been balanced for the last time, the little drawings on the back cover fading but still visible if you hold the page up to the light. And Georgie sits in her chair, in the quiet of a house that has held more happiness and more sorrow than she ever expected when she walked out of a minister's parlour with a deal table and £30, and a heart full of something she didn't yet know was courage. She's tired. She's been tired for a long time, but she isn't finished. She has letters to write, and a gallery to look after, and a council meeting next week, and a sister who needs visiting, and a book she's been meaning to read. There is always something. There is always more to do. But not tonight. Tonight, there is only the quiet, the fire, the slow settling of a house that knows her weight and her habits, and the sound of her footsteps on the stairs. She closes her eyes, she lets the day go, and somewhere, in the silence, she can still hear it, the faint, distant echo of a piano in a cold studio, and the sound of her own young voice, singing. So that's Georgie, a minister's daughter from Birmingham who married a painter and spent her life on the other side of a door, first listening through it, then learning to build something of her own on the side where she'd been left. She isn't in the history books. Not really. Not in the way Ned is, with his paintings in galleries and his name on museum walls. Not in the way Morris is, with his wallpapers and his socialism and his face on the cover of a dozen biographies. Georgie is in the margins. She's in the account book and the sewing machine and the spare blankets folded on the sofa for Allingham. She's in the gallery in Camberwell that's still open on Sunday afternoons. She's in the deal table with the drawer full of engraving tools that she carried into her marriage like a promise she was making to herself. A promise she couldn't keep, not in the way she'd meant to, but that she kept in other ways, in ways that nobody expected, in ways that took a whole lifetime to become visible. And I think tonight about all the people like Georgie, the ones who kept the fires going and the rooms tidy and the children fed, while someone else's name went on the painting, the ones who read aloud for hours so that someone else could work, the ones who absorbed the losses quietly, the broken necklace, the stained dress, the closed door, and got up the next morning and did it all again. They don't have museums, they don't have biographies, they have account books and sewing machines and the faint impression of their hands on things that other people used and never thought to thank them for. But they were there. They were always there. And their steadiness, their patience, their stubborn insistence on keeping things going when everything around them was coming apart, that was its own kind of art. Not the kind that hangs on a wall, the kind that holds a wall up. You're lying somewhere warm right now and the day is over, and whatever you've been carrying today, whatever doors have been closed, whatever work has been invisible, whatever small losses you've absorbed without anyone noticing, you can set it down. All of it. Just for tonight. If something in Georgie's story stayed with you, or reminded you of someone, or made you think of a question you'd like to sit with for a while, you're welcome to leave a word or two in the comments. It doesn't have to be much, just whatever's on your mind. I always read them, and they always matter. This is Boring History for Sleep, and this is what we do here. We tell long, quiet stories about people who lived a long time ago, in rooms that don't exist anymore, doing things that nobody remembers. Medieval kitchens, Victorian parlours, ancient temples, candlelit studies. We'll keep going, slowly, one story at a time, through all the centuries and all the small forgotten lives that made the world we're sleeping in tonight. If you'd like to come along, you're welcome to subscribe so that another evening like this one is waiting for you whenever you need it. There's no hurry, it can wait until morning. For now, the fire is out, the house is dark, the deal table is in the corner, and the tools are in the drawer and the piano lid is down. And somewhere, in a room you can't quite see, a woman with steady hands and a serious face is sitting very still, and she's at peace, and she doesn't need anything from you, and you don't need anything from her, and the silence between you is the gentlest thing in the world. Sleep well,